There are 60,000 of them living in one of the poorest counties in America. They carry English surnames. They speak English as their first and only language. They hold tribal enrollment cards. And when researchers finally ran their DNA, the results came back from places no one expected: Iberia, the Adriatic coast, West Africa, haplogroups that have no indigenous American origin at all, threading through the paternal lines of men who have called themselves Indian for generations. The surnames on their tribal rolls, Cooper, Berry, Chavis, Locklear, some of them appear on a different document entirely. A roster of colonists who vanished from a barrier island in 1587 and were never seen again. In 1590, a ship returned to find the settlement empty. The houses were gone. The people were gone. Carved into a wooden post, a single word. What that word means, who carved it, and where they went is one of the oldest unsolved questions in American history. And the answer may have been hiding in plain sight for 400 years. To understand what the DNA found, you have to understand what history already knew. And what history knew about this people is a story of survival so complete it almost doesn't leave room for mystery. The Lumbee, as they are known today, descend primarily from Siouan-speaking peoples of the Carolina Piedmont. The largest ancestral group was the Cheraw, also called the Sora, who occupied territory near present-day Danville, Virginia. By 1703, they had relocated south. They were joined by the Kiowa, the Eno, the Sacsayhuamahua, the Waccamaw, a dozen nations flowing into each other not by choice, but by catastrophe. The diseases came first, then the colonial wars, then the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717, which shattered the remaining tribal structures of the Carolina interior the way a stone shatters ice. The languages died with the elders who remembered them. The treaty rights expired with the governments that had honored them. The names of the nations dissolved into the name of the river they lived beside. The Lumber River, winding dark and slow through Robeson County, North Carolina. What remained was a people. They kept their communities intact. They kept their land, what little was left. They kept their identity, even when no one in power would agree on what that identity was called. The name changed. The paperwork changed. The legal category changed. In 1885, North Carolina recognized them as Croatan Indians. In 1911, the state renamed them Indians of Robeson County. In 1913, Cherokee Indians of Robeson County. In 1952, the people themselves voted to take a new name, Lumbee, for the river that had been the one constant. In 1956, Congress acknowledged the name, and then, in the same breath, denied them full federal recognition. The name changed, the land shrank, the recognition never came. That is the accepted story. A people devastated by history, scattered by colonial violence, rebuilt in a Carolina swamp on the strength of communal memory. It is a story worth respecting and worth knowing. But there is one detail in the earliest colonial records of Robeson County that sits uneasily in this account. The ancestors of the Lumbee in those records are listed not as Indians. They are listed as free Negroes and mulattoes. In the last 2 decades, the tools of population genetics have caught up with questions that oral history and census records could never answer. And when researchers turned those tools on the Lumbee, what they found was not what anyone predicted. The Y chromosome is the clearest genetic record of paternal ancestry, a line of inherited markers passed directly from father to son, generation after generation, like a surname written not in ink but in the body itself. When you map a population's Y chromosome haplogroups, you are reading 400 years of fatherhood. In the Lumbee DNA project, hosted through Family Tree DNA and drawing on genetic data from enrolled tribal participants, researchers found something startling. Of the male samples analyzed, only a small fraction, roughly 8 men, carried haplogroup QM3, the dominant Y chromosome signature of indigenous Americans. The haplogroup that should be everywhere was barely present at all. The other male lineages clustered into R1b, a haplogroup most common in northwest Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. E1b1a, a West African lineage. Smaller signals of J2 and IM253, associated with the Mediterranean and Scandinavia, respectively. Haplogroups with no indigenous American origin distributed across the paternal lines of a Native American community. But here is the asymmetry that makes this more than a story of simple colonial mixing. The maternal line told a different story. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, unchanged, a record of the maternal lineage the way Y DNA records the paternal one, showed far more indigenous American signal. Haplogroups A, B, C, and D, the classic Native American mitochondrial markers, appear at higher frequency on the maternal side. In 2019, a peer-reviewed paper published in the International Social Science Review examined DNA data from 2,724 participants in the Lumbee family tree DNA project. The researchers found what they described as evidence of Sephardic Jewish male haplotypes, Sephardic Jewish female haplotypes, and male Croatian haplotypes, and argued these were genetic traces of 16th century settlers absorbed into the ancestral population. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The study has drawn methodological criticism, most notably from Lumbee scholar Ryan Emanuel, writing in Southern Cultures in 2024, who pointed out that the study could not verify all participants were enrolled tribal members, rather than genealogy hobbyists with family curiosity. The sample, in other words, may be impure, but the signal remains. The data doesn't confirm the theory, it only fails to rule it out. The first theory is the one historians are most comfortable with, and it doesn't require any mystery to work. The non-native Y chromosome signal in the Lumbee, this theory argues, is simply what happens when a community survives on the margins of colonial society for 200 years. In the swampland borders of Virginia and the Carolinas, the colonial system created a category it called Free People of Color, a legal designation that collected everyone who was neither enslaved nor white, escaped enslaved people who had reached free territory, indigenous survivors whose tribes had ceased to exist as legal entities, white indentured servants who had run from their contracts, free black farmers who had purchased or inherited land, all of them living together, farming together, building families together, beyond the reach of plantation authority. By the 1790 census, Robeson County records already listed the ancestors of the Lumbee as free Negroes, a colonial legal category that flattened African, Native, and mixed-race identity into a single administrative box. Over 2 centuries of intermarriage in a single isolated county, this theory says, produced exactly the complex autosomal and Y chromosome profile we see today. This is a serious theory. It has demographic evidence behind it. It fits what we know about how colonial-era multi-ethnic communities formed and persisted. If the non-native paternal signal were simply the product of random colonial mixing, escaped enslaved men, European settlers, free black farmers folding into an indigenous community over generations, the haplogroup should be broadly distributed. You would expect to see the full range of European lineages present in colonial Carolina. Instead, the signal clusters: Iberian R1b, West African E1b1a, and specifically, haplogroups associated with Sephardic Jewish populations and the Croatian Adriatic coast. Random mixing doesn't produce that kind of specificity. Something more directed, a single event, or a single influx of people would. The second theory is more complicated, and it pulls 4 centuries of American myth into the conversation. In July of 1587, 117 English colonists landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They were the second attempt to establish a permanent English presence in the Americas. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies almost immediately. When he returned, delayed 3 years by the Spanish Armada and its aftermath, the colony was gone. Not attacked, not burned, simply absent, with no bodies and no obvious violence. On a wooden post at the entrance to the settlement, someone had carved a single word: Croatoan. The Croatoan were a native people living on Hatteras Island, 50 miles to the south. The theory, contested but persistent, is that the colonists didn't die. They walked south. They were absorbed. Archaeological work near Hatteras Island has found 16th century European artifacts, pottery fragments, glass beads, copper tools, in stratigraphic layers mixed with indigenous materials. The First Colony Foundation has been excavating in this region for years, and their findings suggest sustained contact between the colonial-era settlers and the Croatoan people. DNA analysis from several Lumbee families has identified European Y chromosome haplogroups, including R1b subclades consistent with 16th century English populations, in lines with no documented European intermarriage in the written record. The Lost Colony DNA Project, operating through Family Tree DNA since 2004, has been tracing surnames like Berry and Cooper that appear on both the 1587 Roanoke colony roster and present-day Lumbee tribal rolls, looking for shared paternal haplotypes that would confirm the connection. But even if every one of those connections holds, even if the colonists did merge with the Croatoan, and the Croatoan are ancestral to the Lumbee, this theory still doesn't explain the Mediterranean signal. The 117 Roanoke colonists were English. They were not predominantly Sephardic. They were not Croatian. Something else must account for those lineages. And this is the part the records don't explain. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, stays within the 16th century, but it complicates the Roanoke story considerably. The 2019 International Social Science Review study did not simply find a generic European signal in the Lumbee. It found specifically J1 and J2 Y chromosome subclades associated with Sephardic Jewish populations. It found R1 A subclades associated with the Croatian coast and the old Ragusian Republic, what we now call Dubrovnik. Haplogroups that are too geographically specific to be explained by English colonial mixing alone. The argument goes like this. In 1492, the Spanish crown expelled its Jewish population, over 100,000 people driven out of Iberia in a single royal decree, following decades of forced conversion and Inquisition-era persecution. Many of those expelled Sephardic Jews resettled in England. 90 years later, their descendants or co-religionists were among the men who signed on to the Roanoke expedition. Merchants, navigators, traders, operating under English names with Iberian roots. The Ragusian Republic, meanwhile, was one of the great maritime trading powers of the 16th century, with commercial networks reaching the West African coast and, through Spanish intermediaries, early knowledge of the Atlantic routes. If some of Roanoke's colonists carried these lineages, and the haplogroup data suggests at least some did, then the DNA preserved in 60,000 living Lumbee citizens may contain the genetic legacy of the Spanish Inquisition itself. The expulsion of 1492, encoded in blood, carried across an ocean, absorbed by a native people on a Carolina barrier island, and passed down for 5 centuries. The data doesn't confirm this, it only raises the question. And the question has no clean answer. Imagine it is late summer in Robeson County. The air is so thick with humidity that sound seems to soften before it reaches you. Voices, wind, the truck going past on the state road, all arriving slightly muffled, like signals from a distance. The Lumber River is dark here, the color of strong tea, stained by tannins from the longleaf pine roots upstream. It smells like pine sap and river mud, and the particular warmth of water that has been sitting in the sun. This is the poorest county in North Carolina. The Lumbee have lived along this river continuously since before any American government had a name for this land. You have a piece of paper in your hand. It is a printout from a genetic testing company, and it contains a code, R1B-S21. Your grandfather told you your people are Lumbee. Your great-grandmother used to say that some of the old ancestors came from across the sea, a phrase everyone assumed was metaphor or memory confusion. The printout says your direct paternal line traces to northwestern Iberia, the border country between what we now call Spain and Portugal, approximately 500 years ago. The paper cannot tell you if your ancestor was a Roanoke colonist who walked into the Carolina interior and never came back. It cannot tell you if he was a Sephardic Jew who fled the Inquisition and crossed an ocean to disappear into a new world. It cannot tell you if he was a Croatian merchant who followed a trade route to its end. It can only tell you he was there, and someone kept him. Here is what the DNA actually reveals, stripped of all theory. On the night of January 18, 1958, a Ku Klux Klan organizer named James Cole, who went by the name Catfish, staged a rally in a field in Robeson County. Cole had announced in the local press that he intended to put the Lumbee in their place, to frighten them into abandoning their Indian identity, which the Klan viewed as an affront to the racial categories that governed the South. He expected, apparently, that a community the federal government refused to fully recognize as Indian would be easy to intimidate. Roughly 500 Lumbee men surrounded the field. Someone cut the power to the lights. In the dark and the chaos that followed, the Klan was routed. Cole was arrested. Photographs ran in newspapers across the country the next morning. Lumbee men, grinning, holding the captured Klan banner above their heads. A community too mixed to be fully recognized as Indian, strong enough to humiliate the Klan on their own ground. The DNA is not a mystery to be solved. It is a record of what the Lumbee actually are, the result of every wave of human wreckage that colonial history produced. Expelled Jews, displaced Adriatic merchants, English settlers who walked into the wilderness and disappeared, African men who had won their freedom and needed somewhere to go, all absorbed by a native people who refused, through 4 centuries of pressure, to stop existing. The door was open. It stayed open. That is the story the genome tells, if you know how to read it. They were never who we thought they were, not because they were hiding something, because the categories we used to describe them were always too small for what they actually were. The Lumbee are not an exception to American history. They are American history, every chapter of it, compressed into a single county in North Carolina. Every forced relocation that happened across this continent happened to them. Every racial reclassification happened to them. Every erasure of language, of treaty right, of legal recognition happened to them. And every act of refusal happened there too. Every rebuilt community, every reclaimed name. Every generation that looked at the available evidence and decided, against all institutional pressure, to remain. One elder in the community, speaking about the DNA results, put it this way: "We always knew we were something they didn't have a word for. Now there's a test that agrees with us." As of this writing, the federal government has still not granted the Lumbee full recognition. Their application has been moving through the Bureau of Indian Affairs for more than 60 years. The DNA has been tested. The haplogroups have been mapped. The surnames match the colony roster. The river still runs dark through Robeson County, carrying whatever it carries: sediment, pine roots, the particular memory of water that has passed through the same place for centuries. What happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke may have been written in that water all along. We just weren't looking at the right document. The Lumbee were never who we thought, and the truth no one expected is that they may be everyone we forgot. The question was never whether they existed. The question is whether we were ever paying enough attention to see them clearly.